The flash of chrome in the driveway caught my eye before I even stepped through the front door, and for a second I thought I had parked in the wrong house because my SUV, the one I'd spent 3 years paying off, was gone, and in its place was an empty space that felt louder than the music inside. My name is Claire Whitmore, I'm 29 years old, and 3 hours ago I still believed tonight would be simple. Just my grandmother's birthday, a quiet dinner, something I could get through without becoming the invisible one again. But the moment I walked into the living room and saw my sister Madison standing near the fireplace, twirling a familiar set of keys around her finger like they belonged there, I realized something had already been decided without me. The room smelled like vanilla candles and catered food, relatives clustered in small circles, glasses clinking, laughter floating just high enough to make everything feel normal, except it wasn't, because my mother was smiling at Madison in that specific way she only used when she was proud, and my father had his hand on Madison's shoulder like he was presenting her to the room, and then I heard it. She needed something reliable, something safe, and Claire barely uses it anyway. My mother's voice, light, casual, like she was explaining a seating chart, not rewriting ownership of something I had fought to earn. I didn't say anything at first because there's a moment in families like mine where you wait for the correction, for someone to laugh and say it's a joke, for reality to snap back into place, but no one corrected her, no one even looked surprised, and Madison just smiled wider, holding up the keys so a couple of our cousins could see, saying something about finally having a proper car now that she and her fiancé were building a real future. That phrase landed harder than anything else because I knew what it meant in our house. Real future meant worthy of investment, and I had never quite qualified. I took a step closer, close enough to see the exact keychain I'd bought at a gas station on a road trip I almost couldn't afford, close enough to know there was no mistake, and when Madison saw me she didn't flinch, didn't hesitate, just said, "Oh good, you're here, Mom and Dad were going to tell you," like this was a favor waiting to be delivered. I remember thinking how quiet everything felt inside my head in that moment, like the volume had dropped out of the room, and I wondered how long this had been planned, how many conversations had happened about my life without me in them, how many times I had been described as the one who could figure it out. The thing about being that person is you start to believe it's your role, that being overlooked is a kind of strength, that not needing anything makes you easier to love. But standing there watching my sister hold the keys to something that had cost me weekends, sleep, and every extra dollar I had, I realized it wasn't about strength at all, it was about convenience. My father finally looked at me then, not with guilt, not even with hesitation, just a steady, practiced calm, and said, "We'll talk about it later," which in our family meant the decision was already final. I nodded because that's what I always did. I nodded and swallowed whatever reaction tried to rise up, and for a split second I almost said it was fine, almost let the moment pass the way I'd let so many others pass, but then I noticed my grandmother, Evelyn Whitmore, sitting at the end of the room, her teacup untouched, her eyes fixed not on Madison, not on my parents, but on me, and there was something in that look I hadn't seen before. Not disappointment, not even sympathy, but recognition. Like she had been waiting for this exact moment longer than I had understood. And as I stood there deciding whether to speak or stay silent, I had no idea that what she would do next wouldn't just change who held those keys. It would change the entire balance of who mattered in this family. No one else in that room noticed the shift, but I did, because Grandma Evelyn did not blink, did not smile, did not reach for her tea the way she always did when things became uncomfortable. She just watched me like she was waiting to see which version of me would show up, the one who nodded and let it go, or the one I had not been brave enough to become yet. And for a moment I felt that familiar pull to keep everything smooth, to make it easy for everyone else to say it was fine even though it was not. But Madison broke the silence first, stepping closer to me with that same bright tone she used when she was performing for people, saying, "It just makes more sense this way, Claire. You work from home most days, and with the wedding coming up we have so much going on." As if my life existed only in the gaps between hers, and I heard a few of our relatives murmur in agreement. Small nods, polite smiles, the kind that say, "This is reasonable," without ever asking the person it affects the most, and my mother added, "You have always been so independent, sweetheart, this is just temporary," which in our family meant permanent unless I fought it, and I almost laughed at that word independent because it had never meant strong, it meant unsupported, it meant no one was going to step in for me, it meant I was expected to absorb the impact quietly so the rest of them could stay comfortable. I looked at my father again, hoping for something different this time, some hesitation, some acknowledgement that this crossed a line, but he just folded his arms and said, "We will figure out the details later, do not make a scene tonight." And that word "seen" landed like a warning because in this house, reacting to being treated unfairly was always worse than the unfairness itself, and I felt the old instinct rise up again, the one that told me to step back, to let it go, to prove I was still the reasonable one, and I could almost see the outcome already. Madison driving away in my car, my parents praising me for being mature, the story retold later as an example of how well I handled things, how easy I was compared to other people, and something inside me tightened at the thought of that version of the night becoming the truth. I took a breath and instead of arguing, instead of raising my voice, I said the quietest thing I could. "So you gave her my car?" And the simplicity of it seemed to catch a few people off guard, because it stripped away all the explanations and just left the fact. And for a second no one answered until Madison lifted the keys slightly and said, "It is not like you paid for all of it yourself." And that was when I understood exactly how they had justified this, how the story had been rewritten in private conversations I was never part of, how my effort had been reduced into something shared, something negotiable, something that could be reassigned to whoever fit the family narrative better. And I felt that same quiet drop inside my chest, the one that had followed me through years of smaller moments just like this, moments where I was told what I had earned was not entirely mine, that my role was to contribute, not to claim. I glanced back at Grandma then, expecting maybe a small shake of her head, a subtle signal to let it go. But she was still watching, still completely still, and then she set her teacup down with a soft, deliberate click against the saucer, a sound so small it should have been lost in the room, but somehow it was not because the conversation around us slowed, then stopped, and she spoke without raising her voice. "Richard," she said, using my father's name the way she only did when something mattered. "Are you certain you want to explain it that way?" And there was something in her tone that made my father straighten slightly, like he had just realized this was no longer just a family conversation he controlled, and I felt the air in the room change, not dramatically, not yet, but enough that I knew whatever came next was not going to follow the script they had already written for me, and I did not realize then that the decision I had almost made to stay quiet had already been taken out of my hands. My father let out a small breath like he was being inconvenienced, like my grandmother had interrupted something trivial instead of stepping directly into a decision he thought was already finished. And he gave a short, controlled smile that I had seen him use in business meetings when he needed to sound reasonable without actually changing anything. "There is nothing to explain, Mom," he said, his tone calm but tighter than before. "We are just making a practical decision for the family." And that word practical moved through the room like it always did, softening the edges of something that would sound harsher if said plainly. But Grandma did not nod, did not accept it. She tilted her head slightly and repeated, slower this time, "For the family," as if she was testing how it sounded out loud, and I saw a few of my relatives glance between them, sensing something was off even if they did not fully understand why. Madison shifted her weight next to me, still holding the keys but not spinning them anymore, her smile a little less steady now, and she said, "It is not a big deal, Grandma, Claire is fine with it." And that sentence hung in the air longer than it should have because everyone knew I had not actually said that, but no one corrected her, no one ever corrected her, and for a second I felt that familiar pull again, the expectation to confirm it, to smooth it over, to make her version of reality easier to accept, and I almost did. I almost said it was fine just to end the moment, but before I could open my mouth, Grandma looked directly at me and asked, "Claire, are you fine with it?" And she did not rush the question, did not soften it. She let it sit there exactly as it was, simple and direct, and I realized I could not remember the last time anyone in this room had asked me something that plainly. My throat felt tight, not because I did not know the answer, but because saying it out loud would break something that had been quietly maintained for years, the unspoken agreement that I would always be the one who adapted, the one who gave way, the one who made things easier for everyone else, and I could feel every pair of eyes on me now, waiting to see which role I would choose again. And I heard my mother say softly, almost like a reminder, "Claire has always been so understanding." And there it was, the script handed to me one more time. I looked at the keys in Madison's hand, at the way her fingers tightened slightly around them as if she already knew this was no longer guaranteed. And then I looked back at my grandmother, and for the first time that night, I did not feel small, I felt seen, and that made it harder to lie, so I said the only thing that felt true, "No, I am not." And the room did not explode or react dramatically, but the silence that followed was heavier than anything before it, because it was unfamiliar, it did not fit the pattern everyone was used to, and I saw my father's expression change just slightly, not anger yet, but something sharper, something calculating, like he was reassessing the situation in real time. Claire, he said, his voice lower now, more controlled. This is not the time to get emotional about something that can be worked out, and I almost laughed at that because there was nothing emotional about stating a fact, but labeling it that way made it easier for him to dismiss it, and Madison stepped in quickly, her voice a little quicker than before. We are not taking anything from you, it is just temporary. You can use Dad's car if you need something. And that offer, that substitution, felt like confirmation of everything I had already understood, that what was mine could be reassigned, replaced, negotiated, as long as it served the version of the family they preferred. Grandma did not respond immediately, she just watched my father for a long second, then Madison, then me, and then she did something so small most people would have missed it. She reached into her handbag slowly, deliberately, like she had all the time in the world, and I felt something shift again, deeper this time, like a line had just been crossed that could not be uncrossed, and whatever she was about to do had not been decided in this moment. It had been prepared long before tonight, long before the keys changed hands, and as my father started to speak again, likely to regain control of the conversation, Grandma lifted her hand slightly, not even looking at him, and said, "Before anyone says anything else, I think it is time we clarify exactly what belongs to whom." And the way she said it made it clear this was no longer a discussion, it was something else entirely, something structured, something that had rules none of us had been told yet. And I did not realize then that this was the moment everything in that room began to turn in a direction none of them were prepared for. My father opened his mouth to respond, but Grandma did not even look at him. She simply reached into her handbag and pulled out a thick cream envelope, the kind you do not use for casual things, the kind that already feels important before it is even opened, and the moment it touched the table I saw something shift in my father's posture, just slightly, like he recognized it, or at least recognized what it might represent, and suddenly the room did not feel like a birthday party anymore. It felt like something else, something more controlled, more deliberate. "Mom, this is not necessary," he said, his voice still measured but no longer relaxed, and for the first time that night, there was a hint of uncertainty in it, but Grandma did not respond to him directly. She slid the envelope across the table toward me, not quickly, not dramatically, just steady, like she had done this motion in her mind many times before, and said, "Go ahead, Claire." And I hesitated, not because I did not want to open it, but because I understood that whatever was inside would make this moment real in a way it had not been before. Around us, the room had gone completely quiet, conversations cut off mid-sentence, glasses paused halfway to lips, every small sound suddenly too loud in the silence, and I could feel Madison watching the envelope, her fingers tightening around the keys she still had not put down, like she was waiting to see if this would actually matter. I picked it up slowly, feeling the weight of it in my hands, thicker than a single sheet of paper, and when I opened it, the first thing I saw was my name printed clearly at the top of a document. Not handwritten, not informal, official, structured, the kind of document that did not exist by accident, and beneath it, numbers, signatures, dates, details that I did not fully process yet but recognized as something far more solid than a conversation that could be talked over or dismissed. "Read the highlighted section," Grandma said, her voice calm, almost gentle, but there was an edge to it now, something precise, and I followed her instruction, my eyes scanning down until I saw the section marked, and the words landed one by one, clear enough that I did not need to read them twice. The funds used for the down payment and initial purchase of the vehicle had been transferred directly from an account held solely by Evelyn Whitmore into an account in my name, designated as a personal gift, non-transferable without my explicit consent, and I felt something inside me go completely still, not shock exactly, but clarity, like a piece of the story I had been missing had just been placed in front of me. "That is not," my father started, but Grandma raised her hand slightly again, not sharply, just enough to stop him, and this time he actually stopped, which was something I had not seen happen in years, and she continued, "The rest explains the legal standing in simple terms." And I turned the page, my hand steady now, reading faster, understanding more, seeing references to ownership, consent, liability, things that did not leave space for interpretation the way family conversations always did. "Claire," Madison said, her voice lower now, less certain, "you do not need to make this into something bigger than it is." But even as she said it, she glanced at my father, not at me, like she was looking for confirmation that this could still be contained, and he did not answer her right away. I looked up from the document then, meeting his eyes directly, and for the first time I did not feel like I was asking for permission to exist in the conversation. I was holding something that could not be reframed into convenience, And that changed the balance in a way that everyone in the room could feel even if they did not fully understand it yet. Grandma leaned back slightly in her chair, finally reaching for her tea again, as if the hardest part was already done, and said, "Now, Richard, explain to me again how this was a practical decision for the family." And there was no anger in her voice, no raised tone, just a quiet certainty that made his earlier confidence sound thinner now. And I realized that what they had done, what they thought was just another adjustment I would accept, had just been placed under a light that did not bend to their version of events, and the moment that had started with my silence was no longer something I could be pushed out of. My father did not answer right away, and that silence said more than anything he could have argued, because for the first time, there was something in front of him. He could not redirect, could not soften with tone or explanation, and I watched the way his jaw tightened slightly as he glanced at the document in my hands, then at my grandmother, then briefly at Madison, like he was recalculating the entire situation in real time, trying to find a version of it that still worked in his favor. "This is being blown out of proportion," he finally said, his voice steadier again but noticeably lower, like he was choosing each word more carefully now. "No one is disputing where the money came from, we are just talking about usage, not ownership." And that distinction might have worked in another conversation in another setting, but standing there with the paper in my hands, it sounded thinner than it ever had before. "Usage?" Grandma repeated softly, almost like she was tasting the word. And then she looked at Madison, not unkindly but directly. "Madison, did Claire give you permission to use her vehicle?" And the question was so simple it left no space to hide, and Madison hesitated just long enough for everyone in the room to notice, her confidence from earlier nowhere in sight now. "Mom said it was fine," she answered, her voice smaller than I had ever heard it. And that shift alone was enough to change the way people around us were watching. "I did not ask what your mother said," Grandma replied, still calm, still measured. "I asked if Claire gave you permission." And there it was, the line that had never been clearly drawn before, now placed in the center of the room where everyone could see it. Madison looked at me then, really looked at me for the first time that night, and I could see something new in her expression, not just defensiveness but uncertainty, like she was realizing the rule she had always relied on might not apply anymore. And she did not answer, which was answer enough. My mother stepped forward quickly, trying to regain control of the moment, her voice softer but edged with urgency. "Evelyn, this is turning into something unnecessary. We all know Claire would have said yes if we had asked her. She has always been generous." And that word generous hit differently now, because I understood what it had been used for all these years, a way to describe giving things up without being asked, a way to frame loss as a virtue. Grandma nodded slightly, as if acknowledging the point, but she did not agree with it. "Perhaps," she said. "But she was not asked." And she let that settle, then added, "And that is the only part that matters." I felt the weight of that statement in a way I could not fully explain because it was so simple, and yet it rewrote something I had accepted for most of my life, that my willingness to adapt did not erase the need for my consent. Around us, the room was no longer neutral. People were shifting, exchanging looks, the quiet kind of reactions that happen when a shared understanding begins to crack. And I realized that this was no longer just about the car, it was about the pattern everyone had seen but never named. My father exhaled slowly, like he was trying to keep the situation contained. "Fine," he said. "Then we will return the vehicle and sort out a better arrangement." And for a second it almost sounded like resolution, like the moment was winding down, like this would end neatly and everyone could move on. And I felt that brief flicker of something close to relief, the instinct to accept it, to let that be enough, to close the door on the discomfort before it grew any larger. But Grandma did not nod, did not accept that version of the ending. She leaned forward slightly, her fingers resting on the edge of the table, and said, "No, Richard, this is not something you return as if it was ever yours to give." And the way she said it shifted everything again, because it was not about fixing the moment anymore, it was about defining it correctly. And I realized then that what I had almost accepted as resolution was just another version of the same pattern, softened, repackaged but unchanged. And for the first time, I understood that this conversation was not going to end with a compromise, it was going to end with clarity, whether anyone in that room was ready for it or not. The room did not relax after that, even though my father tried to move it in that direction, because once something has been named clearly, it does not slip back into something vague again. And I could feel that shift settling into every corner of the space, in the way people stood a little straighter, in the way no one reached for their drinks anymore, like they were waiting to see how far this would go. My father gave a short nod, like he was agreeing just to close the conversation. "Fine, Claire owns the vehicle, no one is disputing that," he said, and his tone carried that same practiced calm, but it no longer held the same authority it had earlier. We simply made a decision based on what made sense for everyone, and I realized that he was still trying to frame it as a collective choice, something reasonable, something that could still be justified if he explained it the right way. For everyone, Grandma repeated again, and this time there was something firmer underneath the words, not louder but sharper, like she was drawing a line that had not been respected before. Tell me, Richard, in this version of everyone, where exactly does Claire say come into play? And the question landed directly without decoration, and I saw a few of my relatives exchange looks again, because it was not a complicated question, but it was one no one had asked out loud before. My mother stepped in quickly, her voice softer, almost pleading now. Evelyn, we are all on the same side here. There is no need to turn this into something adversarial. And that word adversarial felt misplaced, because nothing about what Grandma had said sounded like a fight. It sounded like correction, like something being set back into its proper place. Madison shifted beside me again, and this time she did not look confident at all, her fingers loosening around the keys slightly, like she was no longer sure she should still be holding them, and she said quietly, I did not think it would matter this much. And I believed her in that moment because in our family it had never mattered before, not when it came to me, and that was exactly why it mattered now. I looked down at the document still in my hand, then back up at her, and for the first time I did not feel like I needed to minimize what I was feeling to keep things comfortable. It matters, I said, not loudly, not sharply, just clearly, and the simplicity of it seemed to carry more weight than anything else. I could have added. My father exhaled again, this time more visibly, like the situation was slipping further from his control than he preferred. Then we will correct it, he said, his tone firmer now, trying to re-establish direction. Madison, give your sister the keys and we will move on. And there it was, the attempt to close the moment again, to contain it, to resolve it quickly so it would not expand into something larger. And for a second it almost worked, because Madison looked down at the keys, hesitated, and then started to extend her hand toward me. But Grandma spoke again before the exchange could happen, her voice steady, cutting through the moment without raising in volume. Not yet, she said, and that stopped everything again, Madison freezing mid-motion, my father's expression tightening once more, and even I felt a flicker of surprise because I thought this was the outcome, that the keys would be handed back and that would be enough. This is not just about handing something back, Grandma continued, her gaze moving slowly across the room, taking in not just my parents and Madison, but the people watching, the witnesses to all of this. It is about understanding what was done and why it will not happen again. And there was a weight to those words that made it clear she was not interested in a surface-level fix. She was addressing the pattern itself, the thing that had allowed this to happen in the first place. My father's voice sharpened slightly, just enough to show the strain underneath. Mom, we do not need a lecture, he said, and that was the closest he had come to pushing back directly. But Grandma did not react to the tone. She simply looked at him with a kind of calm that made his resistance seem smaller than he intended. No, she said, you need clarity. And then she turned her attention back to me, and in that moment I realized something I had not fully seen before. This was not just her stepping in for me. This was her making sure I understood something I had never been taught in this family, that what belongs to me does not become negotiable just because someone else wants it. And as I stood there, still holding the document, watching the keys hover between Madison's hand and mine, I understood that what was about to happen next was not just the end of this moment, it was the end of a version of me that had allowed moments like this to pass without being named. Madison's hand froze halfway between us, the keys suspended in that small space like the outcome of the entire night depended on which direction they moved. And for a moment no one spoke, because Grandma had shifted the moment from something simple into something that could not be undone by a quick gesture. What do you mean it will not happen again? My mother asked, her voice carefully controlled but edged with something tighter now, like she was trying to keep this from expanding any further in front of everyone. But Grandma did not look at her, she kept her eyes on me, as if I was the only person who needed to understand what she was about to say. Claire, she said, her tone steady, tell me something honestly, how many times has something like this happened, not the same thing but the same pattern? And that question landed differently than anything else that night because it was not about the car, it was about everything that had led to it, and I felt a flicker of hesitation not because I did not know the answer, but because saying it out loud would make it real in a way that could not be softened or explained away later. I glanced around the room at my parents, at Madison, at relatives who had watched years of small decisions without ever naming them, and for the first time I realized they were all waiting, Not for me to smooth it over, but to see if I would finally say it. More than once, I said quietly, and even that felt like an understatement, but it was enough because the truth did not need decoration, it just needed to exist. Grandma nodded once as if that confirmed something she had already known, and then she finally turned her attention to my parents. That is what we are addressing, she said, and there was no accusation in her voice, just a calm certainty that made it harder to dismiss. Not just this decision but the assumption behind it that Claire's things, Claire's time, Claire's effort can be reassigned without asking her. And the way she laid it out. Stripped away every layer of justification they had been using, leaving only the pattern itself. My father straightened slightly, his voice firmer again. That is not fair, he said, and there was a hint of defensiveness now, the first clear sign that this had moved beyond something he could control with tone alone. We have always treated both girls equally, we have supported Claire in many ways. And I almost smiled at that because I knew exactly what he meant, the kind of support that was mentioned in conversations but never measured in the same way as what Madison received, the kind that sounded balanced if you did not look too closely. Equal does not mean interchangeable, Grandma replied, and that sentence seemed to settle into the room more deeply than anything else, because it reframed everything in a way that was hard to argue with without sounding unreasonable. Madison lowered her hand slightly, the keys no longer extended toward me, just held loosely now, and she said, I did not think it was like that, and I believed her, because she had never needed to think about it that way. The system had always worked in her favor without her having to question it. I looked at her for a second, really looked, and for the first time I did not feel resentment, I felt something closer to clarity, like I was seeing the structure we had both been living in from the outside instead of from within it. It is like that, I said, and my voice did not shake, did not soften, it just held steady in a way I was not used to, and that alone seemed to shift something in the room again, because it was no longer just my grandmother speaking on my behalf, it was me standing in what she had made visible. My mother took a step closer, her expression more serious now. Claire, we never meant to make you feel that way, she said, and there was something genuine in it, but also something incomplete because meaning had never been the issue, impact had, and for once I did not rush to reassure her. Grandma leaned back slightly, her gaze moving across all of us, and then she said something that made the moment settle into place in a way nothing else had yet. Intent does not change ownership, she said. And then, after a brief pause, and it does not replace consent, and those two statements, simple as they were, seemed to close every gap my parents had been trying to use to justify what had happened. The room stayed quiet after that, not tense in the same way as before, but focused, like everyone understood that whatever happened next was not just about resolving the situation, it was about defining what was acceptable going forward. And as I stood there, watching Madison's grip on the keys loosen further, I realized that the moment I had almost let pass earlier was now something entirely different, something that could not be undone, because it had finally been named out loud, and once something is named, it cannot quietly go back to being ignored. Madison's fingers finally loosened, not in a dramatic drop but in a slow, uncertain release, like she was letting go of something she had only just realized was never hers to hold, and the keys made the softest sound as they settled into her open palm, no longer something she could present, just something she was holding without a clear right to, and for a moment she looked at them instead of at me, like the answer might still be there if she stared long enough. Claire, she said quietly, her voice no longer carrying that easy confidence from earlier, I did not think it was that serious, and there was something honest in it, something almost vulnerable, because she had never needed to measure fairness in the same way I had, never needed to question whether something belonged to her before accepting it, and I understood that in a way I had not allowed myself to before. It is not about serious, I said, keeping my voice even because I did not need to push for the moment to hold. It is about mine. And the simplicity of that statement seemed to land more clearly than anything else I had said all night, because it removed every excuse, every layer, and left only ownership. My father shifted again, his expression tightening slightly, like he was trying to regain some control over how this would be remembered. Then it is settled, he said, a little more firmly now. Madison, give your sister the keys and let us move on. There is no need to keep everyone standing here over something that has already been clarified. And there was that familiar push again, the attempt to compress the moment back into something small, something manageable, something that could be forgotten as quickly as possible. Madison looked between him and me, then at Grandma, and for a second it felt like she was deciding which version of the night she wanted to follow, the one she was used to or the one unfolding now, And then she stepped forward, her hand extending fully this time, placing the keys into mine without a word. The weight of them felt different in my hand than it had before, not heavier but clearer, like they represented something more than just the car now, something that had been taken and returned in front of everyone who mattered in this room. But the moment did not dissolve the way it usually would, because no one moved, no one clapped, no one resumed their conversations, and I realized that giving the keys back had not closed anything. It had only confirmed what had already been said. Grandma watched the exchange quietly, then gave a small nod, not to Madison, not to my parents, but to me, and there was something in that nod that felt like acknowledgement not just of the moment but of something larger that had shifted. My mother let out a small breath, almost like relief, and said, "There, everything is back where it belongs," trying to wrap the situation neatly, to signal that the discomfort was over, but Grandma did not respond to that. And neither did I, because we both understood that what had happened was not undone simply because the object was returned. "No," Grandma said after a moment, her voice still calm but unmistakably firm. "It is not back where it belongs, it is finally where it should have been, respected all along." And that distinction settled over the room in a way that made my mother's attempt to close the moment feel incomplete. My father did not argue this time, but he did not agree either. He simply nodded once, tight, controlled, like he was accepting the outcome without accepting the framing, and I could see that he was already thinking about how this would be discussed later, privately, away from this audience. Around us, a few of our relatives began to shift again, not back into casual conversation yet, but into something quieter, more reflective, like they had just witnessed something that did not fit the usual pattern and were still adjusting to it. I glanced down at the keys in my hand, then back up at Madison, and for a second there was a kind of understanding between us that had not existed before, not agreement but awareness, like we both saw the structure more clearly now, even if we stood in different places within it. "I am sorry," she said softly, and it was not loud enough for everyone to hear, just enough for me, and I believed her, but I also knew that apology was not the thing that mattered most in this moment. "I know," I said, and I meant it, but I did not soften it further, did not take it away from what had happened, because this time I was not going to make it easier to forget. Grandma leaned back again, finally lifting her teacup, and for the first time since I had walked in, she took a sip, like the part she needed to play had been completed. But as she set the cup back down, she looked at me once more, and there was something in her expression that told me this was not the end of what she intended to do, just the end of the part everyone else could see. And I did not realize then that what had been returned to me in that moment was only the beginning of something far bigger than a single decision in a living room. The room slowly began to breathe again, but it was not the same air as before. Conversations restarted in lower tones, more cautious, like everyone was aware that something fundamental had shifted even if they could not fully explain it. And I stood there for a moment longer than necessary, the keys still in my hand, the document folded carefully against my side, feeling the weight of both in a way that had nothing to do with metal or paper. My mother was the first to try to restore normalcy, stepping toward the kitchen and calling out something about dessert, her voice just a little too bright, like she was trying to stitch the evening back together before it unraveled any further, and a few relatives followed her lead, moving away from the center of the room, giving us space without making it obvious, but the distance only made the moment feel more defined, like the stage had been cleared for what came next. My father remained where he was, his posture composed again, but I could see the tightness in his expression had not disappeared, it had just been tucked away, and when he looked at me it was not with anger, not even disappointment, it was something more measured, like he was reassessing me in a way he had not needed to before. "We will talk later," he said quietly, not as a dismissal this time, but as a statement, and I understood that whatever this conversation would be, it would not follow the same pattern as before. Madison lingered a few steps away, no longer the center of attention, no longer holding something that positioned her above me in that moment, and she looked smaller somehow, not physically, but in the way someone does when the rules they relied on no longer hold the same certainty, and she met my eyes again briefly before looking down, like she was still trying to process where she stood now. I could have stepped away then, could have taken the keys, thanked Grandma, and let the rest of the night dissolve into something easier, something forgettable, but I did not move because for the first time, I understood that walking away too quickly would turn this into just another isolated moment instead of what it actually was, a shift that needed to settle fully. Grandma watched me for a second longer, then gave a small, almost imperceptible nod, like she understood exactly what I was thinking without needing me to say it, and then she spoke again, not loudly, not in a way that pulled the entire room back in, but clearly enough that those closest could hear. "Claire," she said, "keep the document." And that simple instruction carried more meaning than it seemed on the surface, because it was not just about proof, it was about ownership that could not be reinterpreted later. I nodded, sliding the paper back into the envelope carefully, and as I did, I noticed something I had missed before. A second sheet tucked behind the first, thicker, more detailed, something I had not fully read yet, and for a brief second curiosity flickered, but I did not pull it out, not here, not in front of everyone, because whatever else was inside that envelope felt like it belonged to a different moment, one that had not arrived yet. My father noticed the movement, his eyes narrowing slightly as if he had caught a glimpse of something he had not expected, and for a split second, I wondered how much he knew about what Grandma had prepared and how much of this was new even to him. "We are done here," my mother said from across the room, her voice steadier now, calling people back toward the table, toward plates and candles and anything that could make the evening feel like it had not just been interrupted by something uncomfortable and undeniable. And slowly people followed, filling the space again with movement and sound, but it was different now, quieter in a way that felt more intentional. I stepped back slightly, moving toward the edge of the room, not retreating, just giving myself space to take in what had just happened. And as I did, I realized something that settled deeper than anything else that night. The moment had not ended when I got the keys back. It had ended when I stopped accepting that what was mine could be decided by someone else. I did not realize then that the second paper in that envelope would matter just as much as the first, or that what Grandma had set in motion tonight was not just about correcting one decision, but about changing what decisions could even be made about me moving forward. The rest of the evening moved forward in pieces, like a conversation that had been interrupted and never fully found its rhythm again. People returned to their seats, plates were passed around, candles flickered on the table as if nothing had happened, but every glance that landed on me lingered just a second longer than before, not with pity, not even curiosity, but recognition, like they had just been introduced to a version of me they had not noticed until now. I stayed near the edge of the room at first, not hiding, just observing, holding the envelope against my side, feeling the edges of the second document through the paper, aware of it in a way that kept pulling my attention back, even as conversations restarted around me. My mother moved between guests with practiced ease, asking about travel plans, refilling glasses, doing everything she could to restore the tone of the evening, but there was a tightness in her smile that had not been there before, and every time her eyes flicked toward me, it was quick, almost cautious, like she was not entirely sure how to approach me now. My father remained quieter than usual, speaking when spoken to, his tone controlled but more measured, and once, when he thought I was not looking, I caught him glancing at the envelope in my hand, his expression unreadable, like he was still trying to determine how much had shifted and what it would mean beyond this room. Madison stayed close to the table, no longer moving through the space with that effortless confidence she had carried earlier, her posture more contained, her voice softer, and when someone asked her about the car, she hesitated before answering, choosing her words more carefully than I had ever seen her do, as if she understood now that the story could not be told the way it had been before. I finally moved toward the back hallway, away from the center of the room, needing a moment where I could hear my own thoughts without them being shaped by everyone else's reactions, and as I leaned against the wall, I slid the envelope open again, just enough to pull out the second document I had noticed earlier. It was thicker, more detailed, multiple pages stapled neatly, and as I scanned the first few lines, I realized this was not just about the car. It referenced a separate account, a structure, something set up in my name with terms that extended beyond a single purchase. And I felt that same quiet stillness settle in my chest again. The kind that comes when something you thought was small reveals itself to be part of something much larger. Footsteps approached before I could read further, and I looked up to see Grandma standing in the hallway entrance, her presence as steady as it had been all night, and she did not ask what I was looking at, she already knew. "Not here," she said gently, nodding toward the document. "That is for later." And I slid it back into the envelope without argument, because I trusted the timing she had already set into motion. "You did well," she added after a moment, not in a congratulatory way but in a way that acknowledged something internal, something that had shifted in me more than anything external had. And I found myself nodding without fully knowing how to respond, because what I felt was not pride, it was clarity, a kind I had not had before. "I almost let it go," I admitted quietly, and she gave a small, knowing smile, the kind that held no judgment, only understanding. "Of course you did," she said. "That is what you have been taught to do." And then after a brief pause, "But that does not mean you have to keep doing it." Her words settled deeper than anything else that had been said that night, because they did not just explain what had happened, they pointed to what could change moving forward. And for the first time I saw that this was not just about correcting one moment, it was about rewriting a pattern I had accepted without question for most of my life. From the dining room I could hear laughter starting to return, lighter now, more cautious, like the evening was trying to find a new balance, and I realized that when I walked back in, it would not be as the same person who had walked out of that driveway hours earlier, scanning for my missing car, hoping for a simple explanation, because what I had found instead was something far more permanent than a set of keys, and I had a feeling that whatever was written in that second document was only going to make that even clearer. When I stepped back into the dining room, nothing looked dramatically different, the same table, the same candles, the same plates half finished, but everything felt slightly off, like a picture that had been adjusted just enough that you could not unsee the change, and as I took my seat again, I noticed the way conversations shifted when I joined them, not stopping completely but recalibrating, like people were choosing their words more carefully now, aware that something had been exposed that could not be easily covered again. My mother placed a slice of cake in front of me, her movements precise, controlled, and she said, "Here, your favorite," in the same tone she had used for years, but it did not land the same way because I could hear the effort behind it now, the attempt to return to something familiar that no longer fit. "Thank you," I said, and I meant it, but I did not soften it into anything more, did not fill the space the way I normally would, and she nodded quickly before turning to someone else, like she was relieved not to linger in that moment. Across the table my father finally spoke again, addressing me directly, his voice low enough that it did not carry beyond our end of the table. "We will need to review what your grandmother has set up," he said, and there was something deliberate in the phrasing, not asking, not suggesting, but positioning himself back into a role of oversight, and for a second the old instinct flickered, the one that would have agreed automatically, would have deferred without thinking, but I felt the envelope against my side again, the weight of what it represented, and I understood that this was one of those moments where the pattern could either continue or shift. "I will review it," I said, keeping my voice steady, and I did not add anything else, did not invite him into that process the way I might have before, and I saw the smallest change in his expression, not anger, not even surprise, but recognition, like he had just encountered a boundary he had not expected to be there. He nodded once, slowly, and did not press further, which in itself felt like something new, something that had not happened before without resistance. Madison glanced between us, quieter now, and after a moment she said, "I really am sorry, Claire," a little louder this time, enough for my mother to hear, enough for it to exist beyond just the two of us, and I looked at her, seeing not just my sister but the role she had been allowed to play for years without question, and I realized that while she had benefited from it, she had also never been asked to see it clearly until now. "I know," I said again, and this time there was a slight pause after, not uncomfortable, just honest, because I was not trying to resolve everything in that moment, I was just letting it exist as it was. My grandmother sat at the head of the table, quieter now, observing more than speaking, but every now and then her eyes would move to me, and there was a steadiness there that made everything else feel less uncertain, like even if I did not fully understand what she had set in motion, I was not standing in it alone. As the meal continued, small conversations resumed, but they circled different topics now, lighter ones, safer ones, and I noticed how often people avoided referencing what had happened directly, as if naming it again might reopen something they were not prepared to engage with, but the absence of it did not erase it, it just made it more present in a quieter way. At one point one of my aunts leaned slightly toward me and said, "You handled that very well," and I almost corrected her, almost said that I had not handled it at all, that I had almost let it pass the way I always did, but I realized that what she had seen was not just the moment itself, it was the difference in how I stood in it, and that difference was enough to be noticed. "Thank you," I said instead, and let that be enough. As the evening began to wind down, people gathering coats, saying their goodbyes, I felt a kind of calm settle in that had nothing to do with resolution and everything to do with clarity, and as I stood to leave, the keys in my hand and the envelope tucked securely under my arm, I understood something I had not before, that what my grandmother had given me was not just proof or protection, it was permission, permission to define what belonged to me and how it was treated, and as I walked toward the door, I had a quiet sense that whatever was written in that second document would not just support that shift, It would make it permanent in a way no one in that house could ignore. The house was quieter by the time I stepped out into the driveway, the kind of quiet that follows something unresolved, not loud enough to be called tension but too present to be ignored. And for a moment I just stood there, the cool night air settling around me, the keys resting in my palm, solid and unmistakably mine. And I realized this was the first time I had ever held on to something in this house without second-guessing whether I should give it up. The empty space where my car had been earlier was no longer empty. It was filled with something else now, something invisible but heavier. The understanding that what had happened inside had not just been a correction, it had been a line drawn. I walked toward the SUV slowly, almost deliberately, like I needed to feel each step connect to the decision I had finally made. And when I opened the driver's door, the familiar scent hit me, clean fabric, a faint trace of coffee from mornings I had rushed out the door, small details that suddenly felt more meaningful than before because I had nearly lost them without being asked. I placed the envelope on the passenger seat, hesitated for a second, then sat down behind the wheel, closing the door with a soft click that seemed louder than it should have been in the stillness of the driveway. I did not start the engine right away. I just sat there, looking at my reflection in the darkened windshield, trying to recognize the version of myself looking back, because something about her felt different, not stronger in a dramatic way, not transformed, just clearer, like the edges of who I was had finally come into focus. I reached for the envelope again, this time pulling out the second document fully, unfolding it carefully under the dim light from the porch, and as my eyes moved across the pages, I felt that same stillness return, deeper this time, because what I was reading was not just a detail, it was a structure, a trust account set up in my name, established months ago, funded with a sum large enough to change more than just a single purchase, with clear terms that placed control solely with me, not shared, not implied, not open to interpretation, and attached to it were notes in my grandmother's handwriting, small, precise, explaining that she had watched long enough to know what needed to be protected before it could be taken for granted again. I exhaled slowly, not in shock but in recognition, because this was not impulsive, this was planned, deliberate, something she had prepared quietly while the rest of us moved through the same patterns without questioning them. A faint sound behind me made me glance up, and I saw the front door open slightly, a silhouette in the light, my father standing there for a moment before stepping out onto the porch, his posture still composed but less certain than I had ever seen it, and even from this distance I could tell he was watching me, not the car, not the house, but me, like he was trying to understand something that had shifted beyond his reach. I folded the document carefully, placing it back into the envelope, and for a brief second I considered going back inside, explaining, discussing, trying to ease whatever this had become, but the thought passed as quickly as it came, because I understood now that this was not something that needed to be explained into comfort. It needed to be lived differently. I started the engine then, the familiar sound grounding in a way I had not expected, and as the dashboard lights came on, I felt something settle into place inside me, not a reaction to what had happened, but a decision about what would happen next. As I pulled out of the driveway, I caught one last glimpse of the house in the rearview mirror, the lights still on, the door still open, my father still standing there, and for the first time, I did not feel like I was leaving something behind that I needed to return to in the same way, because what had changed tonight was not just a single moment, it was the role I had been playing in every moment before it, and as the house disappeared from view, I realized that whatever conversation waited on the other side of this night would not be about convincing me to go back to how things were. It would have to meet me where I had already decided to stand. I did not drive far that night, just far enough to put distance between the house and the version of myself that had walked into it earlier, and I found myself parked along a quiet street lined with dim porch lights and neatly trimmed lawns, the kind of place where everything looks settled from the outside, even when it is not, and I sat there with the engine idling, my hands resting lightly on the steering wheel, feeling the steady hum beneath me, grounding in a way that felt new. For years, I had measured my place in my family by how little I disrupted things, how easily I adapted, how quickly I made space for other people's needs without asking where mine fit in, and it had become so natural that I had stopped noticing it, stopped questioning it, until tonight forced me to see it clearly, not as kindness, not as strength, but as something that had been quietly taken advantage of because it had never been challenged. I reached over and touched the envelope again, not opening it this time, just acknowledging it, because I understood now that what my grandmother had given me was not just financial security or legal clarity, it was something far more significant. It was a shift in authority, a way of placing control back into my hands in a form that could not be dismissed or reinterpreted, and that realization settled deeper than anything else that had happened that evening. My phone buzzed lightly in the cup holder, and for a moment I considered ignoring it, but I glanced down and saw my father's name on the screen, not a message, just a call, and I let it ring once, twice before answering, not out of hesitation, but because I wanted to be certain of how I would respond before I did. "Claire," he said when I picked up, his voice steady but quieter than usual, stripped of the authority it normally carried. "We should talk about this." And there was no instruction in it this time, no expectation that I would immediately agree, just an acknowledgement that the conversation had changed. "We will," I said, and I meant it, but I did not offer a time, did not shape it into something immediate or convenient for him, because for the first time I understood that I was allowed to set that pace. There was a brief pause on the other end, and then he said, "Your grandmother went too far tonight." And I almost smiled, not because I agreed, but because I recognized the shift in framing, the attempt to place the disruption somewhere outside of what had actually happened, and I shook my head slightly even though he could not see it. "No," I said calmly, "she was exactly where she needed to be." And I let that sit there, not pushing it further, not explaining it, because I no longer felt the need to make it easier for him to accept. Another pause followed, longer this time, and when he spoke again, his voice was different, less certain. "This changes things," he said, and for the first time it sounded less like a concern and more like a realization. "Yes," I replied simply, because there was nothing else to add to that. We ended the call not with resolution, not with agreement, but with an understanding that something fundamental had shifted and would not shift back. And as I set the phone down, I felt a kind of quiet settle over me, not the kind that comes from everything being fixed, but the kind that comes from finally seeing things clearly. I turned off the engine after a moment, the sudden stillness filling the car, and I sat there just a little longer, letting the weight of the night settle into something steady instead of overwhelming, and I realized that what had changed was not just how my family would treat me moving forward, it was how I would allow myself to be treated at all. I had spent years believing that being easy to love meant asking for less, taking up less space, needing less in return, but tonight had shown me that what I had been calling ease was actually absence, and that absence had made it easier for everyone else to decide things for me without ever asking if they should. I picked up the keys again, turning them lightly in my hand, the small metallic sound grounding in a way that felt symbolic now, not just of ownership but of choice, and I understood something I had not fully grasped before, that keeping what was mine did not make me difficult, it made me present in my own life in a way I had never been allowed to be. As I stepped out of the car and into the quiet street, the night air cooler now, I felt something settle into place with a clarity that did not need to be explained, and I knew that whatever came next, whatever conversations waited, whatever adjustments needed to be made, they would not be built on the same foundation as before, because that foundation had finally been named, challenged, and replaced with something that belonged to me. And this time I was not going to hand it back.